Boone Mercer slammed both fists onto the counter so hard the glass jars rattled, and one hit the floor and shattered. Elira Voss didn't flinch. She had learned after years alone in this store that flinching only invited more. But when the mountain man raised his eyes to hers, those ruined, desperate, hollow eyes, she felt something crack open in her chest that she had kept sealed for a very long time. "I need a wife," he said, "by tomorrow morning. If you've ever felt completely alone in a room full of people, stay with me because this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel and follow every part to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The bell above the door of Voss General Store had not rung with that kind of violence since the winter of 1887, when a drunk trapper had kicked it open during a blizzard and collapsed on the floor with frostbitten toes. That had been dramatic. That had been memorable. But it had not been this. Boone Mercer filled the doorframe the way a storm fills a valley completely suddenly, and with the particular quality of something that cannot be reasoned with. He was not a tall man in the way of stories, not a graceful man, not the kind of man whose entrance made women straighten their hair. He was wide across the shoulders, in a way that looked structural, like load-bearing timber. His jaw carried a scar that began at the left corner of his mouth and traveled up toward his cheekbone, pale and old, and healed wrong. His hands, when he pressed them flat to the counter, were the size of dinner plates and shaking. The three women browsing near the fabric bolts went still. Old Harmon Price, who had been examining a tin of tobacco near the window, turned his head and then appeared to decide that whatever was happening was none of his business, and returned to the tobacco. The young boy sweeping the back corner stopped sweeping. Elira Voss looked up from the ledger she had been correcting. She had made an error in Tuesday's accounts, a small one, but it had been bothering her all morning, and she looked at the man standing on the other side of her counter, and she thought with the practical portion of her mind that never really slept, "He's going to be trouble." She set down her pen. "Help you," she said. His eyes found hers, and for a moment he didn't speak. His jaw worked. His hands pressed harder into the counter. He smelled of pine sap and wood smoke, and something underneath both of those things, something raw and animal and afraid, though she did not identify that last part until later. "I need a wife," he said. "By tomorrow morning." Somebody near the fabric bolts made a small sound. Elira did not look to see who. She kept her eyes on Boone Mercer, and she kept her face very still, and she said, "I beg your pardon." "You heard me." His voice was not unkind. It was simply stripped of everything that wasn't the essential fact. "I need a wife. By tomorrow morning. And I was told—" He stopped. His throat moved. "I was told you might be the only woman in this town who doesn't have a husband already." One of the women near the fabric bolts whispered something to the other. Elira heard the shape of it without hearing the words, and she knew it was something unkind. That kind of whisper she had learned to identify by its rhythm alone. A short intake, a lean toward the other person, a hushed syllable that ended in something like laughter. She had been the subject of that particular rhythm for years. She had stopped letting it reach her. She looked at Boone Mercer. He was not looking around the store. He was not aware of the whispers, or if he was, he did not care. He was looking at her with those eyes that had something terrible in them, something she could not name, and she thought, "He's not dangerous. He's drowning." Those were two very different things. "Mister," she said, "why don't you tell me what's actually going on?" He blinked. It seemed to surprise him that she hadn't screamed or thrown him out, or simply stared at him in horror. He blinked again, and some of the rigidity went out of his shoulders, and he said in a voice that was quieter now, and somehow worse for it, "It's my daughter." Elira waited. "She's 7 years old," he said. "Her name is Ivy. Her mother—" He stopped again. His jaw tightened. "Her mother passed 6 weeks ago. Fever. Ivy's been staying with her mother's sister in Carson City, but the sister can't keep her. So they're putting her on a train, and she gets in tomorrow morning 8 o'clock, and there's a man coming with her, a county man, a government man, and he's going to look at my situation and decide whether Ivy stays with me or goes to the state home." The store had gone completely quiet. Even the whispers near the fabric bolts had stopped. And your situation, Elira said carefully, is that you're not married. My situation, Boone said, is that I live alone on a mountain, and I haven't been fit company for any living creature in 3 years, and every person in this county knows it. His hands came off the counter. He folded them in front of him, and she saw that he was gripping his own fingers very hard. They won't give her to me, not as I am. But if I had a wife, a household, something that looked like a family, you think they'd look the other way? I think I'd have a fighting chance. Elira looked at him for a long time. The clock on the wall behind her ticked. Outside, a horse shifted its weight on the hitching post, and the wood creaked. You don't know me, she said. No, ma'am. You walked into my store and you asked me to marry you. Yes, ma'am. Why me? He looked at the counter. His jaw worked. Because Walt Hennessy at the livery told me you were alone. Because I went to the preacher first, and he told me there wasn't a single woman in Cedar Fork without a husband or a father or a brother who'd shoot me for asking. And then he told me... He stopped. His neck reddened. He told me about the woman who runs the general store. He said you were decent. He said you kept to yourself. He said you wouldn't laugh. Elira thought he asked the preacher. He went to the preacher before he came here. She thought he didn't go to a saloon and find some woman desperate enough to agree to anything. He went to a preacher. She thought that means something. She wasn't sure what. I'd laugh, she said, if this wasn't so clearly the most serious thing you've ever said in your life. Something crossed his face. It wasn't quite surprise. It was the expression of a man who had braced for a blow and felt it land somewhere other than he expected. It is, he said quietly, the most serious thing. The 3 women near the fabric bolts were leaving. Elira heard the bell above the door, and then the sound of feet on the porch, and then the particular silence that meant news was already traveling down the street. By supper, everyone in Cedar Fork would know that Boone Mercer had walked into the general store and asked Elira Voss to marry him. She had about 4 hours before the story became something else entirely in the retelling. She said, Old Harmon, would you step outside for a spell? Old Harmon did not argue. He set the tobacco tin down and walked out without looking at either of them. The boy with the broom followed without being asked. The door closed. Elira and Boone Mercer stood on opposite sides of the counter in the empty store, and Elira folded her hands on top of the ledger she had been correcting and said, Tell me about the mining collapse. His whole body changed. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was a kind of quiet implosion. Everything pulling inward, his shoulders, his jaw, the space behind his eyes. Who told you about that? He said. Nobody had to tell me. You said you haven't been fit company in 3 years. The Kettle Creek collapse was 3 years ago. 11 men died. The papers said 1 survivor. She paused. I read the papers, Mr. Mercer. He was quiet for a very long time. I was the foreman, he said at last. I know. I gave the order to go deeper. There were signs anybody who knew what they were looking at could have read the signs, but the mine owner was pushing us, and I... He stopped. His hands found the counter again, not slamming this time, but pressing flat, steadying himself. I gave the order. 11 men went in. I was the only one who came out. And Ivy's mother, Clara. He said the name like it cost him something. Clara and I, it wasn't what it should have been. She was good. She was better than I deserved. I left her before the collapse. I left because I was a coward, and I didn't know how to love anything properly. And then after Kettle Creek, He shook his head. I went up the mountain and I stayed there. I didn't know about Ivy. Clara never wrote. I don't blame her for that. You didn't know you had a daughter. Not until 6 weeks ago, until a letter came. His voice had dropped very low. Ivy's 7 years old, and I've never once laid eyes on her, and her mother is dead, and she's coming here tomorrow morning, and she's all I have left in this world that is worth anything at all. Elira looked at him. She looked at this enormous, scarred, shaking man, who had survived a disaster that had broken him so completely he had retreated to a mountain for 3 years, and she thought about what it meant to choose isolation. She thought about what it meant to be so afraid of the world and your own damage that you went somewhere no one could reach you. She thought about herself. She thought about 7 years of running this store alone. 7 years of that particular whisper at the fabric bolts. 7 years of being the woman who didn't have anyone and didn't expect to, and had made a kind of peace with that, or told herself she had, which wasn't the same thing. She thought about what it felt like to forget that you could be needed. This would be legal, she said. A legal marriage. Yes, not... She paused, choosing words carefully. Not in name only, in any way that puts me at risk. Legal. Recorded. Yes, ma'am. I'd sign whatever you needed signed. I'd have no claims on your store or your property. You could have it all drawn up in writing. And when the custody question is resolved, he looked at her steadily. I reckon that would be up to you. She drummed her fingers once on the ledger. Just once. What does Ivy know? She said. Nothing yet. She knows she's coming to her father. She doesn't know about any arrangement. She can't know it's an arrangement, Elira said. Not at first. Maybe not ever, depending on how she is. A 7-year-old who just lost her mother doesn't need to know that the woman in her house is there on contract. He looked at her sharply. You're saying yes. I'm saying I haven't said no yet. She looked at him. I want to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. All right. That child is going to come off that train tomorrow morning, and she's going to look at you. And she's going to be scared, and she's going to be grieving, and she's going to have every reason in the world to be angry at you specifically. Can you stand there and take that, whatever she gives you? Can you stand there and take it without breaking and without running? The silence stretched out long enough that the clock ticked 4 times. I don't know, he said. It was the right answer. She knew it immediately, the way you know certain things in your body before your mind catches up, that it was the right answer because it was the honest one, and a man who was trying to charm her or manipulate her into agreement would have said yes without hesitating. I don't know, he said again, but I'll try. Whatever it costs me, I'll try. She nodded slowly. My name is Elira, she said. Not ma'am. Elira. Boone, he said. And then, as if remembering, Boone Mercer. I know who you are. She straightened. I'll need to close the store for the morning. I'll need someone to watch it. I'll ask Mrs. Aldridge, she's helped before. We'll need the preacher. Can you be at the church at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning? Boone Mercer stared at her. He stared at her the way a man stares at something he expected to be a wall and turned out to be a door. 6 o'clock, he said. The train comes at 8. That gives us 2 hours to be married and get to the station and look like 2 people who chose each other. She opened the ledger, found a clean corner of a page, and picked up her pen. Now, tell me everything about the county man who's coming with her. What's his name, what's his authority, and what exactly does he need to see? For the next hour, Boone Mercer stood on the other side of Elira Voss's counter and told her everything he knew. He told her about the letter from the county office. He told her about the magistrate in Carson City who had written the terms of the custody review. He told her that the government man's name was Aldous Fenn, that he had a reputation for being thorough, that he would want to see the living quarters and speak to neighbors and satisfy himself that the child would have not just a roof, but a household, Elira wrote. She wrote quickly and clearly, her handwriting small and precise, the kind of handwriting that comes from years of keeping careful accounts. She made a list of what they needed. She made a list of what she would bring from the store. There were things in the storeroom she'd been holding back for herself. A quilt she'd ordered special from a woman in Denver, some kitchen goods she hadn't had occasion to use. She made a list of what questions Fenn was likely to ask and what the answers needed to be. She asked Boone what his cabin looked like. He was quiet for a moment. It's livable, he said. That's not what I asked. Another pause. It's sparse. There's a table, 2 chairs, a bed, a wood stove. I built most of it myself. Is there a room for Ivy? There's a loft. We'll need a bed in that loft before tomorrow afternoon. I can build one tonight. She looked up. You can build a bed in 1 night. I built the whole cabin in 2 weeks, he said. A bed frame's not complicated." She looked at him for a moment, at his hands, at the set of his jaw, and she thought he's telling the truth. Whatever else this man is, he's not a liar. "All right," she said. "A bed in the loft. Something on the walls. She's 7, she'll need something. A picture, a scrap of fabric, anything that says this space was made for her." He nodded. "I'll come up with you tonight," she said, "to see the space before tomorrow. I need to know what we're working with." He stared again. "I'm not walking into that train station with a man whose house I've never set foot in," she said simply. "If Fen asks me one question about where we live, I need to answer it without flinching." "That's yes. That makes sense. Good." She closed the ledger. "Then go get your horse and come back at 4 o'clock. We'll ride up together. I'll see the cabin. I'll bring what I can carry, and you'll have a bed frame built by midnight." Boone Mercer picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the counter. He held it in both hands. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude, but something underneath it that was larger and more complicated. "Why?" he said. She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" he said. She thought about giving him a practical answer. She had several ready. She was 42 years old with no prospects, and a store that needed a man's name attached to it in this county if it was going to keep its license after the new regulations came through. She had practical reasons. She could have listed them. Instead, she said, "Because you came in here and told me the truth. You didn't dress it up. You didn't try to make yourself sound better than you are." She met his eyes. "And because there's a 7-year-old girl getting on a train right now who doesn't have a mother anymore, and she shouldn't have to lose her father too, just because the law can't make room for a man who's trying." Boone Mercer put his hat on. 4 o'clock, he said. 4 o'clock, she confirmed. He walked to the door. The bell rang, and then the door opened again, and he half-turned, and he said without looking fully at her, "Elira." She waited. "I'll do right by you," he said. "Whatever this is, I'll do right." And then he was gone. Elira stood in the empty store for a long moment. She looked at the shattered jar on the floor that she had not yet swept up. She looked at the list she had written. She looked at the clock. 3 hours and 40 minutes to 4 o'clock. She picked up her pen and started a second list. Things she needed to think through. Questions she needed answers to the precise sequence of what tomorrow would require. Her handwriting was steady. Her hands did not shake. But somewhere in the center of her chest, underneath the practical, steady rhythm of her thinking, something was moving that had not moved in a very long time. She did not examine it too closely. There was too much work to do. At exactly 4 o'clock, the sound of hooves came down the main street of Cedar Fork, and Elira was already on the porch with 2 canvas bags packed, and her coat on, and her best hat. Not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because if she was going to ride up a mountain to see a stranger's cabin, she was going to do it looking like herself, and not like a woman who had been caught off guard. Boone pulled up on a gray horse that was enormous and looked ill-tempered. He looked at the bags. "I'll carry those," he said, and dismounted before she could argue, and took both bags and tied them to the horse's saddlebag with the efficient movements of a man who didn't waste time on unnecessary gesture. He put his hands together to give her a boost up, and she considered his hands for exactly 1 second, and then accepted the help because pride was not a useful commodity when you were trying to get up onto a very large horse. They rode out of Cedar Fork in the late afternoon, with 3 or 4 people watching from the sidewalk in the particular way that people watch something they intend to have strong opinions about later. And Elira did not look at any of them, and Boone did not look at any of them. And neither of them said anything until the town was behind them and the mountain road had closed around them in its quiet. "The cabin's about 40 minutes up," he said. "All right." They rode in silence for a while. The road was steep and rocky in places, and Boone's horse navigated it with the indifference of long habit. The air changed as they climbed cooler, cleaner, carrying the smell of pine and something else that Elira associated with high places, a kind of stripped-down clarity that she had always found easier to breathe in than town air. "Tell me about her," she said. "Ivy. What do you know?" He was quiet for a moment. "The letter said she's quiet, that she reads already, she's ahead for her age. The aunt said she took her mother's passing hard." He paused. "I reckon that's to be expected." "Did the aunt say anything else?" "She said Ivy has a way of watching people, like she's working out whether they're worth the trouble before she decides anything about them." Alira thought about that. A 7-year-old who watches people before she decides. A 7-year-old who has just lost her mother and is being sent to a father who is a stranger. "She sounds smart," Elira said. "That's what scares me," Boone said. "A smart child's going to know if something isn't right." "Then we'd better make sure something is right," Elira said. He glanced at her sidelong. She was looking at the road ahead. "You're not afraid," he said. "Of what?" "Of this. Any of this." He paused. "Most women would have screamed and thrown me out." "I'm not most women," she said. Not proud about it, just a fact. He looked at the road. "No," he said. "You're not." The cabin came into view as the sun was lowering, not quite golden, yet that particular late afternoon light that makes everything look more considered than it is. Elira saw it through the trees first, a solid shape, low-roofed, built from logs that had been chosen carefully, the gaps chinked tight. She had expected worse. She had prepared herself mentally for worse. She swung down from the horse before he could assist her, and walked to the door and pushed it open. She stood in the doorway and she looked. He had not been lying. A table, 2 chairs, a wood stove with a stack of cut wood beside it that was impressively tall. A bed against one wall with a wool blanket folded at the foot of it, military neat. A single window. A shelf with 3 books and a tin cup and a folding knife. The loft above accessible by a ladder empty. It was clean. That was the first thing she really registered. It was clean. Not decorated, not comfortable in any conventional sense, but scrubbed and ordered and intentional. "It's not much," he said behind her. "It's solid," she said. "Better than I expected." She walked in. She walked to the shelf and looked at the 3 books, a surveying manual, a Bible worn soft with handling, and a book of poetry she did not expect to find in this particular location. She turned. Longfellow. He looked for the first time slightly embarrassed. "It was my mother's." She set the book down. She looked at the loft. "Show me what you're planning for the bed frame." He showed her the wood he had already hauled up from behind the cabin, good cedar planks, more than enough. He told her what he was going to build and how. She listened and asked 2 questions, and then said it sounded right and began unpacking her bags. She had brought the quilt, the blue and white one from Denver, which she had been saving for no specific purpose, which she now understood had perhaps been waiting for this. She had brought a small hooked rug in red and yellow. She had brought a tin of licorice drops from the store because a 7-year-old who had just ridden a train alone deserved something sweet without having to ask for it. She had brought a small square of yellow cloth and 4 small wooden buttons. "What's that for?" Boone asked, looking at the cloth. "The wall in the loft," she said. "You said something on the walls. I'll make something tonight while you build." He stared at her. "You sew." "I run a general store," she said. "I do whatever I need to do." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his tools and started building. Elira Voss sat on one of the 2 chairs, and she cut and she stitched, and she listened to the sound of Boone Mercer working above her in the loft. The careful rhythm of it, measured and deliberate, a man who built things slowly because he understood that what was built slowly held. The wood stove heated the cabin as the night came in, and the wind picked up outside, and somewhere in the trees an owl called once. By 9 o'clock the bed frame was done. By 10 o'clock the quilt was spread across it, and the rug was on the floor, and on the wall, hung from a small nail Boone drove in without being asked, was a yellow cloth square with 4 wooden buttons arranged on it in the shape of a simple flower, which was not beautiful in any elaborate way, but which was the kind of thing a child could look at and understand meant someone was thinking of you before you got here. They stood in the loft and looked at it. "That'll do," Elira said. Boone said nothing for a moment. Then, "It'll more than do." They climbed down. He put the kettle on the wood stove, and they sat at the table with 2 tin cups of strong black tea, and outside the mountain was dark and windswept and very quiet, and inside the cabin was warm. "What happens," he said, "if she hates it here?" "Then we help her not hate it." "What if she hates me?" Elira looked at him across the table. "She might," she said. "That's real, and you should be ready for it. But hate is just fear that doesn't have anywhere else to go. Give her somewhere else for it to go." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I don't know how to do any of this." "No," she said. "Neither do I. But we'll figure it out." He looked at her. In the lantern light, his scar was very visible, and his eyes were very tired, and he looked like a man who had been holding himself together through sheer stubbornness for 3 years, and was starting just barely to believe that something might hold him instead. 6 o'clock at the church," he said. 6 o'clock, she said. She rode back down the mountain alone. He had offered to ride with her, but she had declined, said she knew the road well enough, which was not precisely true, but was close enough. She rode down in the dark with the lantern he'd hung on the saddle horn, and she thought about the yellow cloth flower on the wall of a loft that had been empty this morning and would have a child in it by tomorrow night. She thought about a 7-year-old girl on a train moving through the dark toward a mountain, and a father and a stranger who had agreed for reasons she was still working out herself to be something like a mother. She thought about what Boone had asked her. Why? She thought she might be starting to know. But Cedar Fork's church bell was already ringing 11 o'clock when she crossed the edge of town, and tomorrow was going to come early, and there were still things to think through before it did. She put her head down against the night wind and rode. The church bell had not yet rung 6 when Elira arrived at the door of Cedar Fork's only house of worship, and Boone Mercer was already there. He was standing on the steps in a clean shirt, dark wool, the collar buttoned straight, and his boots had been polished, and his hair had been combed, and he was holding his hat in both hands, the way he had held it in the store the day before. And he looked like a man who had not slept. She had not slept either. She didn't mention it. "You're early," she said. "So are you," he said. They looked at each other in the gray morning light, and neither of them said the obvious thing, which was that they were about to walk into this church and become husband and wife in front of God and Reverend Tillis and whatever witnesses the Reverend had managed to call on 24 hours' notice, and that neither of them had done this before, and that they were both in their separate and private ways terrified. Elira had dressed carefully. Not in white, she had no illusions about the symbolism of that, but in her best dress, the deep blue one, with the small buttons at the wrist, that she had ordered from the catalog 2 years ago and worn exactly twice. She had done her hair with more attention than usual, not for him, for herself. Because if she was going to do this, she was going to do it as herself, not as a woman in a work dress, looking like she'd been caught off guard by her own life. "Reverend Tillis is inside," Boone said. "And the Aldridges, Walt Hennessy, that's all." "That's enough," she said. He moved to open the door, and then stopped. He turned. "I need to say something before we go in." She waited. "If at any point today you change your mind," he said, "you tell me. Right up until the moment Tillis asks, you can tell me no, and I'll walk out of that station alone and figure something else out. I am not going to hold you to this if you've had second thoughts." Elira looked at him steadily. "Have you?" He blinked. "Had second thoughts," she said. "Have you?" "No," he said. "But I'm not the one taking the larger risk here." She considered that for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Open the door, Boone." He opened the door. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Reverend Tillis was a small man with large glasses and a voice that was always slightly too loud for the space he was in, and he read the words with the careful attention of a man who was not entirely sure this was a good idea, but had decided that the pastoral duty outweighed his reservations. Mabel Aldridge cried. Her husband looked at the floor. Walt Hennessy cracked his knuckles once and then held very still. When Tillis said, "Do you take this woman?" and Boone said, "I do," His voice did not waver. When Tillis said, "Do you take this man?" and Elira said, "I do," her voice did not waver either. There was no ring. She had not expected one and had not wanted the awkwardness of one produced from a pocket like a thing thought of at the last minute. Tillis pronounced them married, and Boone looked at her and gave a single small nod, the kind of nod that meant, "I understand what this is, and I will not pretend it is something else," and she gave the same nod back. Outside the church, Mabel Aldridge hugged her without warning and said, "Oh, Elira," in a voice full of complicated feeling, and Elira said, "Thank you, Mabel," and extracted herself gently. Walt Hennessy shook Boone's hand and didn't say anything, which was more respectful than most things a person could say. They had an hour and 40 minutes before the train. Boone had the wagon, not the horse she'd ridden the night before, but a proper wagon cleaned out with a blanket on the seat. She noticed that the blanket was the same gray wool from his cabin bed, and thought he thought about the cold. He thought about whether she'd be cold on the ride. She filed that away without comment. They drove toward the station in a quiet that was different from the quiet of strangers. Something had shifted in the 12 hours since he'd walked into her store. She couldn't have named it precisely, but it was there, a kind of altered gravity between two people who have agreed to step off the edge of something together. "Tell me what to do," he said. "At the station, with Fen." "Let me do most of the talking," she said. "You stand close. Not uncomfortable close, but close enough that it's clear. You don't apologize for anything. You don't explain yourself unless he asks a direct question. If he does ask a direct question, answer it short and honest and then stop." Short and honest. "Men like Fen are looking for cracks," she said. "The more you talk, the more chances there are to find one. Short answers leave less to examine." He absorbed this. "And Ivy. Ivy is not a case to be managed. She's a child." Elira paused. "When she comes off that train, don't go to her with open arms. Don't rush her. Let her see you first. Let her take the measure of you." "What if she—" He stopped. What if she won't come with us?" The question landed with its full weight. Elira had thought about this in the night, in the hour she'd spent lying awake running through possibilities. She'd thought about what a 7-year-old who had just lost her mother might do when confronted with a father she'd never met, and a woman who was a complete stranger. "If she won't come," Elira said, "we don't force her. We give her a reason." "What kind of reason?" "I don't know yet. That depends on who she is." She looked at him. "You said she's smart. Smart children respond to honesty more than to comfort. So we don't lie to her. We don't pretend everything is fine. We tell her the truth in a way that leaves room for her to choose." Boone was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about children." "I've watched a lot of them come through my store," she said. "For 7 years. Every kind of child there is." He nodded slowly. Something in his expression was careful and considering the expression of a man who is revising his understanding of something. "Elira," he said. Thank you, for last night. The loft." She looked at the road. The loft needed doing. "The flower," he said. "On the wall. She's going to—" He stopped. His jaw moved. "She's going to see that and know somebody put it there for her." "That was the intention. I know, He cleared his throat. "I just wanted to say." She nodded, and they drove on. The station at Cedar Fork was not large a platform, a ticket window, a bench with 3 slats missing a water barrel at the end. There were 4 other people waiting for the 8 o'clock train, 2 men in work coats who were clearly expecting freight. An elderly woman with a basket and a man standing slightly apart from the others who was wearing a gray suit that was too good for Cedar Fork and holding a leather case and looking at everything with the measured professional attention of someone who gets paid to look. Aldous Fen was shorter than Elira had pictured. He had a thin face and very clean hands and eyes that moved constantly cataloging. He saw them arrive and his eyes moved over both of them, and she saw him register the details, the wagon, the clothes, the way they stood in relation to each other, and file them all away. "Mr. Mercer," he said, walking over. Not a question. He'd known what Boone looked like from a description. "That's me," Boone said. Aldous Fen, County Office of Child Welfare. He extended his hand, and Boone shook it, and then Fenn looked at Elira. "And this would be my wife," Boone said. "Elira Mercer." Hearing her name said that way, her name, and then his name, was a stranger experience than she had anticipated. She held out her hand, and Fenn shook it, and his eyes went briefly to her left hand, which had no ring on it, and she watched him clock that absence. "We were married this morning," she said pleasantly before he could speak. "A small ceremony at the church. We didn't want to wait on formality when there was a child coming who needed to know she was coming to a family." Fenn looked at her. His expression did not change. "This morning. Reverend Tillis performed it. The Aldridges witnessed. You're welcome to verify." She smiled the way she smiled when a customer was trying to underpay for something warm and immovable. "We've been known to each other for some time. The timing was well." She glanced at Boone with the particular look she had decided on in the night, the look that meant this man and I have a history I'm not going to explain to a stranger. Ivy's arrival made us stop dithering. Boone did not say anything. He stood close the right distance, and his face was carefully neutral. She had told him short and honest, and he was taking that seriously. Fenn wrote something in a small notebook. "I'll need to see your living situation before I make any determination," he said. "The magistrate's requirement is that the child be placed in a stable household. I'll be making a home visit this afternoon." "Of course," Elira said. "We'll be there." The train whistle came from somewhere in the distance, long and low. Everyone on the platform shifted slightly toward the track. Fenn stepped back to his position. The two freight men straightened. The elderly woman with the basket clutched it tighter. Elira felt Boone go very still beside her. She did not look at him. She looked at the track. "It's all right," she said quietly, barely a breath of sound. "Is it?" he said. "She's on that train," Elira said. "She's been on that train since yesterday. She's been sitting with her little bag and her fear and her grief for hours and hours, and the whole time she's been doing that, you built her a bed. She doesn't know that yet. But she will." He breathed out. Just one breath. But the rigidity in him shifted, not gone, but redistributed like something finding its balance. The train came in. It came in the way trains come in everywhere, with noise and steam and a slowing wait that takes longer than you think. And then it was there, and the doors were opening, and people were stepping down, and Elira watched the doors, and she thought, which one, which car, which small figure with a bag? And then she saw her. Ivy Mercer came off of the second car, holding a cloth bag that was almost as big as she was gripping the handle with both hands. She was small, smaller than Elira had expected from the image she'd constructed, with dark hair in 2 braids, and a gray coat that had been mended at one cuff with brown thread that didn't quite match. Her face was the shape of her father's, the jaw, and the set of the eyes. But everything else, the mouth, the expression, was somebody else's. Her mother's. She stood on the platform and she looked around, and she found Boone. She looked at him for a long time. Boone did not move. He stood exactly as he was, and he let her look. His hands were at his sides, and Elira could see them, both of them, and they were not in fists, and they were not shaking, and she thought, good. That's good. Ivy walked toward him, each step deliberate, the way a child walks when they have decided to be brave and are using all available energy to maintain it. She stopped 2 feet in front of him. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. Neither of them spoke. Then Ivy said in a voice that was very clear and very steady and entirely too old for a 7-year-old, "Are you my father?" "Yes," Boone said. No embellishment, no apology yet. Just yes. Ivy looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked at Elira. "Who are you?" she said. Elira crouched. Not all the way down. Not the exaggerated crouch of adults who want to seem smaller than they are, but enough to bring her face closer to Ivy's level. "My name is Elira. I'm your—" She paused for exactly 1 beat. "I'm with your father." "Are you his wife?" Ivy said. "Yes." He didn't have a wife before. "No," Elira said. He didn't. Ivy considered this with the focused attention of someone filing an inconsistency away for later examination. Her eyes were extraordinary dark and very clear and absolutely exhausted in the specific way that children get when they have been crying for a long time and have run out of tears and are now simply carrying the weight of it without any remaining capacity to put it down. "My mother died," Ivy said. "I know," Elira said. "I'm very sorry." "Are you going to pretend you're my mother?" The directness of it hit like a hand on a table. Behind Ivy, Elira could see Fen watching with his notebook, and she could see Boone's jaw tighten, and she knew that the wrong answer here, either too eager or too dismissive, would register on whatever internal scale Fen was running. She said, "No, I'm not going to pretend anything. Your mother was your mother. Nobody's going to be that." She held Ivy's eyes. "But I'd like to be someone who makes sure you have what you need, if that's all right with you." Ivy looked at her, looked and looked, that watching quality her aunt had described in the letter, working out whether this woman was worth the trouble. Then she looked down at the cloth bag in her hands. Then back up at Elira. "I have her picture," Ivy said. "My mother's. In my bag. I'm not leaving it anywhere." "Then it comes with you," Elira said. "We'll find somewhere good to put it." Something shifted barely perceptible in the set of Ivy's shoulders. Not a thaw, not even close to a thaw, but the absence of an immediate refusal. Fen stepped forward. He introduced himself to Ivy in the careful, flat voice of a government man who has done this many times and knows that children can hear insincerity the way dogs hear high pitches. Ivy looked at him and answered his 3 questions. Yes, she had been on the train. No, she wasn't hungry. Yes, she understood she was going to stay with her father in the same clear, deliberate voice she'd used for everything else. Then she picked up her bag and looked at Boone and said, "Can we go?" It wasn't warmth. It wasn't acceptance. It was a 7-year-old who had been traveling since yesterday and was exhausted to the bone and had made the calculation somewhere in that remarkable processing mind of hers that forward was better than stopped. Boone said, "Yes, the wagon's just there." He reached for her bag, and Ivy tightened her grip on it for exactly 1 second and then released it. He carried it to the wagon and stowed it with the same careful efficiency he used for everything, and then he stood by the wagon wheel, and Ivy looked at the height of the seat and looked at him. He held out his hands. She looked at his hands, his enormous, scarred, careful hands, and she reached up and let him lift her onto the seat. Elira climbed up on the other side, and Ivy sat between them. And Boone took the reins, and they drove out of Cedar Forks Station with Aldous Fen following behind in the county's horse and buggy, and the whole town watched them go, and the morning light was starting to warm, and Ivy held her cloth bag in her lap with both hands, and did not speak. After a few minutes, Elira said, "Have you ever been on a mountain?" Ivy shook her head. "They're very quiet," Elira said. "In a good way. Not the kind of quiet that's empty, the kind that's full." Ivy looked at her sidelong. "What's it full of?" "Wind, birds, the sound of trees." Elira paused. "Pine sap. Your father's chopping wood if it's morning." "I chop wood every morning," Boone confirmed without looking at anyone. Ivy processed this. "Why?" "Wood stove," Boone said. "Keeps the cabin warm?" "Every morning. Winter especially. Takes about an hour." Ivy seemed to find this information acceptable. She looked at the road. Then, "What do I call you?" The question was directed at Boone. He kept his eyes on the horses. She could feel him thinking. "Boone," he said, "if you want, or whatever you want, whatever feels right." Ivy considered. "What if nothing feels right?" "Then you don't call me anything," he said, "until something does." Ivy looked at the road. "Okay," she said. It was not reconciliation. It was not the beginning of a bond. But it was one 7-year-old's declaration that she was willing to wait and see, which, given everything, was more than either of them had any right to expect. The home visit that afternoon was the most sustained performance of Elira's adult life, and she had not realized until she was in the middle of it just how much her years of running a business, of managing difficult customers, of negotiating with suppliers, of presenting a face that was calm and reliable, and exactly what the situation required had been preparation for exactly this. Fen walked through the cabin with his leather case and his notebook and his cataloging eyes, and Elira walked with him and answered his questions, and Boone stayed back not because she'd told him to, but because he'd worked out on his own that his particular presence, enormous, scarred, barely verbal, was better deployed as backdrop than foreground. The kitchen goods she'd brought from the store were on the shelf. The quilt was on the bed downstairs. She'd moved it from the loft, made the loft purely Ivy's space. The wood stove was burning steady. The 3 books were on the shelf. Longfellow, the Bible, the surveying manual. Fen stopped in front of the shelf. He looked at the books. He looked at the poetry. "Yours," he said to Elira. "His," she said. "He reads to me from it in the evenings." She did not look at Boone when she said it. She heard from somewhere behind her the smallest possible intake of breath, and she pressed on. "We're not a complicated household, Mr. Fen," she said. "I ran my family's store for 12 years. I know how to manage a home. Boone knows this mountain better than anyone alive. Between us," she paused. "Between us, we know how to take care of things." Fen wrote in his notebook. He asked about schooling. There was no school within easy reach of the mountain, and Elira said she had been a reader her whole life, and would see to Ivy's education herself until they could make other arrangements. He asked about medical needs, and Elira said the doctor in Cedar Fork made house calls, and she knew him personally. He asked about Boone's income, and Boone from the doorway said he trapped and sold furs, and had a small silver claim he worked part of the year, and had money enough saved to last 3 winters without touching it. Fen asked to see Ivy's room. They climbed the loft ladder, Fen first, then Elira. Ivy had already been up there. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, with her cloth bag open beside her, and she had taken the picture out a small framed photograph, a woman with dark hair and Ivy's eyes, and she was holding it in her lap. She looked up when they came in. Fen looked around the loft. He looked at the bed, the quilt, the rug, the wall. He stopped at the yellow cloth with the 4 wooden buttons. He looked at it for a moment. He wrote something in his notebook. Then he looked at Ivy. "Do you know who made that?" he said, nodding toward the cloth. Ivy looked at it. She looked at Elira. Elira said nothing. "She did," Ivy said. "Before I got here." She was quiet for a moment. "She made it so I'd have something." Fen wrote in his notebook. They came back down the ladder. Boone was standing in the middle of the cabin with his arms at his sides, and his face doing that careful neutral thing, and Fen looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "tell me about the Kettle Creek collapse." The room went very still. Elira did not move. She watched Boone, and she willed him without saying a word to remember what she'd told him. Short and honest, and then stop. Boone said, "I was the foreman. I gave the order to go deeper. 11 men died. I was the only one who came out." "And afterward," Fen said. "I came up here," Boone said. "I stayed. For 3 years. Yes. What changed?" Boone's eyes moved just briefly toward the ceiling, toward the loft where Ivy was sitting with her mother's picture. "I got a letter," he said. "That changed." Fen looked at him for a long time. The silence in the cabin had weight. Then Fen said, "I've seen men survive things like Kettle Creek. The ones who shut themselves away." He paused. "Some of them stay shut. Some of them find a reason to open back up." He looked at Boone carefully. "Which one are you?" "I don't know yet," Boone said. "But I'm trying to find out." It was the same kind of answer he'd given Elira in the store. Not the right answer, not the polished answer, just the honest one. And she watched Fen process it the same way she had the slight recalibration of a person who expected performance and got truth instead. Fen closed his notebook. "I'll make my recommendation to the magistrate," he said. "Given the circumstances, the timing of the marriage, the living situation, I'm going to need to make 2 follow-up visits. 1 in 30 days, 1 in 90. "That's fine," Elira said immediately. "If either visit reveals the arrangement to be—" He stopped. Something in his face was careful. If either visit reveals circumstances materially different from today, the magistrate reserves the right to revisit the custody determination. Understood, Elira said. Fenn looked at Boone. Boone nodded. Fenn packed his leather case, said good day to both of them, and left. They listened to his buggy wheels on the mountain road until they could no longer hear it. Then Boone sat down on the bench beside the wood stove and put his head in his hands. Boone, Elira said. Give me a minute, he said. Muffled. Not broken? Just give me a minute. She gave him a minute. From above them, from the loft, came a small sound, a kind of movement. And then Ivy's face appeared at the top of the ladder looking down. She looked at her father with his head in his hands. She looked at Elira. Did he say I can stay? Ivy said. He said he's recommending it, Elira said. Yes. Ivy's face did something complicated. The exhaustion and the grief and the wariness were all still there, all exactly in their same positions, and underneath them, like something very small and very new, trying to push through winter ground something else. Okay, she said, in that same deliberate voice. She disappeared back up the ladder. Boone lifted his head from his hands. His eyes were red but dry. He looked at Elira, and she looked at him. She can stay, he said. She can stay, Elira confirmed. He looked at the ceiling. At the sound of small feet moving around up there, the cloth bag being reorganized, the slight creak of the bed frame he'd built with his own hands the night before. I don't know how to do this, he said, for the second time. But it was different now. It wasn't the despair of before. It was something closer to wonder. Like a man standing at the edge of a country he has no map for, and realizing that the not knowing might not be the worst thing that has ever happened to him. None of us do, Elira said. That's the whole point. She sat down in the other chair and picked up the tin cup she'd had that morning, and it was cold, but she held it anyway, and the wood stove crackled, and from the loft above them came the small, careful sounds of a child beginning to put her things in order in a new place. It was not a family yet. It was barely the outline of one. But the outline was there, faint and crooked, and for the first time in 3 years the cabin held more than one person's silence. And that was something. That was more than something. Outside the window the mountain was doing what it always did. The wind through the trees, and the cold coming down from the upper slopes, and the particular quality of late afternoon light that turned everything it touched into something that almost looked like belonging. Boone Mercer looked at his hands. Then he stood up and went to the woodpile and picked up the axe because it was nearly evening and the stove would need feeding through the night, and you couldn't sit with wonder forever. At some point you had to keep the fire going. And Elira watched him and thought, so this is what we are now. 2 people and a child and a mountain, and the slow, frightening, necessary work of choosing each other every single day. She thought I could live inside that. She thought I might already be. The first week in the cabin was not a disaster. It was something quieter and in some ways harder than a disaster. It was a negotiation conducted entirely in silence, in small gestures, in the particular tension of 3 people moving around each other in a small space, each one trying to take up exactly the right amount of room, and none of them certain what that was. Ivy woke before dawn every morning. Elira heard her the first time, the creak of the loft floorboard, the careful step on the ladder, the way she moved through the dark cabin without lighting anything, finding the door by memory and slipping outside. Elira lay still and listened. After 10 minutes, Ivy came back in. Her feet were cold. Elira could hear it in the way she moved quick and precise back up the ladder. The second morning, Elira left a pair of wool socks at the bottom of the ladder before she went to sleep. She did not say anything about it. In the morning, the socks were gone, and Ivy did not mention them, and neither did Elira. But at breakfast, salt pork and cornbread. Boone cooked it without apology, and it was better than it had any right to be. Ivy looked at Elira once across the table with those exhausted, considering eyes, and then looked back at her plate. It was not gratitude, but it was acknowledgement. From Ivy at this stage, that was the same thing. Boone was the harder problem. He was not cruel. He was not cold exactly. But he was a man who had spent 3 years becoming a person who did not have to manage anyone else's presence. And the effort of reversing that showed in him the way effort always shows in people who are not accustomed to being watched in small misalignments, moments where his face did something unguarded before he caught it. The first real rupture came on the 4th day. Ivy had been reading. Elira had found a copy of a children's book in one of her bags, a thin, worn thing she'd taken from the store's lending shelf, on an instinct, and she had been reading it at the table in the afternoon, her small face bent close to the pages, and it was the most relaxed Elira had seen her. Something in the concentration of reading seemed to give Ivy permission to stop performing composure, and for half an hour, she had simply been a child absorbed in a story. Boone came in from outside and the door banged. Ivy startled so hard, the book hit the floor. And then, something happened in her face. The startle became something else. Something deeper. A kind of total bodily alarm that was not about the door at all. And she pressed herself back against the wall, and her breathing went wrong. And her eyes went somewhere that was not the cabin. Elira was up and across the room in 3 steps. She did not touch Ivy. She crouched in front of her and said quietly and steadily, "Hey, you're here. You're in the cabin. The door just banged, that's all." Ivy's breathing was ragged. Her hands were gripping the edge of the table. "Look at me," Elira said. "Ivy, look at my face." Ivy looked. Her eyes were wild and dark, and somewhere far away. "You're here," Elira said again. "I'm right here. Nothing happened." Boone had frozen in the doorway. His face had gone the color of old ash. He understood in the way a person understands something they've been trying not to understand exactly what he was looking at. A child who had been through something before her mother died. Something that had left her body on a hair trigger. Something that a slamming door could detonate. "Ivy," he said. His voice was very low. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Don't," Elira said. Not to silence him. Just not yet. Not while she's still finding her way back. He closed his mouth. Ivy's breathing slowed. Her hands relaxed on the table edge. She looked at Elira, and then at Boone, and then she looked at the book on the floor, and something in her face closed back up like a window being shut. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," Elira said. "I don't need—" Ivy stopped. She picked up the book. She smoothed the pages. "I'm fine," she said again. Elira stood. She went back to what she'd been doing, mending one of Boone's shirts a tear in the shoulder seam. And she did not look at Ivy again, and she did not look at Boone, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a person who has just been seen at their most vulnerable is to stop looking. Boone went back outside. He did not bang the door. That night, long after Ivy was in the loft, Elira was banking the wood stove for the night when Boone spoke from where he was sitting on the bench. "What was that?" he said. "This afternoon." She kept her hands on the stove latch. She was frightened. "That wasn't just frightened," he said. "I've seen frightened. That was—" "Yes," Elira said. "It was." He was quiet. The aunt's letter didn't say anything about— The aunt may not have known, or may not have wanted to put it in a letter. She turned. Children who lose a parent the way she lost Clara, especially if the end was hard, sometimes their bodies learn to expect bad things. It's not something she chose. It's something that happened to her. Boone looked at his hands. "What do I do?" he said. "You don't slam doors," Elira said. "You move slowly. You warn her before you do anything sudden. You give her time." "I can do that. I know you can." She paused. "And Boone?" He looked up. "She's going to have more of those moments. Maybe worse ones. When she does, your job is not to fix it. Your job is to stay in the room." He looked at her for a long moment. "Is that what you do? Stay in the room?" "It's the only thing I know how to do," she said. but it turns out that's mostly what people need. The second week was harder in some ways and easier in others. Ivy began to talk more, not warmly, not yet, but with the specific verbosity of a child who has been containing herself for too long and is starting incrementally to let things out. She asked questions, relentless, practical, slightly disarming questions that she directed primarily at Elira, but occasionally carefully at Boone. She asked Elira how the wood stove worked, and Elira showed her. She asked Boone what the name of the mountain was, and he told her, Mercer Ridge. Though he hadn't named it. It had been named by the surveying team that mapped the area 12 years ago, and Ivy had said, they named it after you, and Boone had said, after the family, I reckon. And Ivy had thought about this and said, so I'm a Mercer too, and Boone had gone very still and said, yes, you are. Ivy absorbed that and did not say anything more about it. But the next morning, when she went outside in the pre-dawn, she was wearing the wool socks and also the small wool scarf Elira had hung by the door without comment 2 days before, and she stood on the porch for a long time, looking out at the mountain she apparently now had a claim on, and her face in the cold, dark morning was still complicated, but it was also maybe very slightly something like considering. The 30-day visit from Aldous Fenn arrived like a clock striking the hour precise and impossible to ignore. Elira had been aware of it coming the way you're aware of weather. She had not talked about it with Boone, not explicitly, but there had been a kind of silent preparation in both of them, a tightening that wasn't quite fear, but was adjacent to it. 30 days was not a long time. They had not become a family in 30 days, but they had become something, and the question was whether Fenn's calibrating eyes would see whatever that something was and find it sufficient. He arrived on a Tuesday morning. Ivy was at the table working through the arithmetic Elira had been teaching her, and she looked up when Fenn came in and then looked back at her work, which was either supreme self-possession or the behavior of a child who has decided that government men are not worth interrupting her multiplication for. Fenn watched her for a moment. He looked at the cabin, the same cabin, but 30 days lived in now, with Ivy's drawings pinned to the loft railing, and Elira's sewing basket on the shelf next to Boone's Longfellow, and a pair of child-size wool socks drying by the wood stove. He asked his questions. He asked them to each of them separately, which Elira had anticipated. He took Boone outside and talked to him for 20 minutes. He sat with Elira at the table, while Ivy continued her arithmetic, and asked her about the household, about routines, about how Ivy was adjusting. She has difficult moments, Elira said honestly. She lost her mother recently, and her body is still working that out. But she's reading ahead of her age. She's doing arithmetic. She's curious about everything. She paused. She belongs here. Fenn wrote in his notebook. Then he did something unexpected. He closed the notebook and he looked at Ivy and he said, Ivy, can I ask you something? Ivy looked up. Yes. Do you like it here? Ivy considered this with the same focused deliberateness she brought to everything. She looked at her arithmetic. She looked at the wood stove. She looked at the yellow cloth flower on the wall of the loft, visible from where she sat. It's quiet, she said. In a good way. Elira felt something move in her chest. Is there anything you don't like? Fenn asked. Ivy thought about it. The outhouse is cold, she said. Fenn made a sound that might from a certain angle have been a suppressed laugh. He wrote something in his notebook. He stood up, said good day, and left. Boone came back inside. He looked at Elira. Well, he said. I think we're all right, she said. He breathed out. He sat down. He looked at Ivy, who had returned to her arithmetic with the serenity of a person who has said exactly what needed to be said, and considered the matter concluded. The outhouse is cold, he said. It is, Ivy confirmed without looking up. Boone looked at Elira. Something in his face was doing a thing she had started to learn to read, a kind of helpless, bewildered tenderness that he had no vocabulary for and no practice expressing, and so it just sat there on his face, unguarded, enormous. I'll insulate it, he said. Tomorrow, Elira suggested. Tomorrow, he agreed. The twist that came at the 6-week mark was not from Fenn or the county or anything Elira had thought to prepare for. It came from Cedar Fork, and it came in the form of a woman named Harriet Crane. Harriet Crane was the wife of Douglas Crane, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county, and had for many years operated under the understanding that the mountain above Cedar Fork, Mercer Ridge, was effectively unoccupied territory that could be used for summer grazing without complication. Boone's presence had been tolerated because Boone, shut away and silent, and clearly not interested in engaging with anyone, had never pushed back on the cattle. That had apparently been a miscalculation on Douglas Crane's part, because Douglas Crane had recently learned that the ridge had an actual household on it now, with an actual wife who ran a general store and knew the county land records, and had in the process of closing up that store and moving her personal effects to the mountain pulled the original land grant document that her father-in-law Boone's father had filed in 1871. Elira had found it in the store's back room, tucked into a crate of her own family papers that had somehow gotten mixed with the previous owner's effects when she bought the building. She hadn't known what to do with it at first. She'd sat with it for 3 days, reading the legal language, carefully matching it against what she knew of the county survey maps. And then she understood what she was looking at. The land grant covered not just the cabin site but 400 acres of the upper ridge. Douglas Crane's cattle had been grazing on Mercer land for at least 8 years. She told Boone on a Sunday evening after Ivy was in the loft. She put the document on the table between them, and she watched him read it. She watched his face as he worked through the legal language. He was not a fast reader, but he was a careful one, which she'd learned about him the way she'd learned everything about him in the patient accumulation of small observations, and she watched the moment when the meaning of it registered. He set the document down. "How long have they been grazing up here?" he said. "At least 8 years, she said. "Probably longer." "And nobody told me." "Nobody thought you were paying attention." He looked at the document. "What does this mean?" "It means the upper pasture is yours, all of it, and any cattle run on it without your permission is trespass." She paused. "It also means Douglas Crane is going to be very unhappy when he finds out you know." Boone looked at her. "How would he find out?" "Because I already sent a letter to the county land office," she said, "registering the claim. It would have been filed yesterday." She watched him absorb this. She had not asked him first. She had made the decision and acted on it and told him afterward, which was either the action of a woman who understood what needed to be done and did it, or the action of a woman who had overstepped in her husband's affairs, and she did not entirely know which one he was going to decide it was. His face was very still. "You did that," he said. "Yes." "Without telling me?" "Yes." She held his eyes. "I should have told you first." "That's fair." "But the filing window was closing, and you were up on the north slope all day, and if I'd waited—" "You did right," he said. She stopped. "You did right," he said again. "I should have filed that claim years ago, and I didn't because I didn't care about anything." He looked at the document. "I care now." She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Douglas Crane is going to come up here," she said. "Let him come. He may bring men." Boone looked at her steadily. "Let him bring men." There was something in his voice that she had not heard before. Not aggression, not bravado, but a kind of settled, quiet certainty that came from a man who has finally found something worth defending. Harriet Crane arrived 2 days later. Not Douglas Harriet. Alone in a buggy, dressed in a town dress that was clearly calculated in the way of women who understand the weaponized quality of appearances. She came to the cabin door and knocked, and Elira answered it, and the two women looked at each other. "Mrs. Mercer," Harriet said, making the name sound like a question. "Mrs. Crane," Elira said, making hers sound like a period. "My husband asked me to come and speak with you. He felt—" Harriet paused. "He felt that one woman speaking to another might be more productive." "That depends on what your husband wants to be productive," Elira said. "Come in." Harriet came in. She looked at the cabin. She looked at Ivy, who was in the corner working on a drawing. She had developed a passion for drawing things, particularly the mountain birds she saw through the window, and Ivy looked up at her and then back at her drawing. They sat at the table, and Harriet put forward her husband's position, which was that the land grant was very old and possibly unclear in its boundaries, and that surely something could be worked out, and perhaps the Mercers would consider a formal grazing lease at a reasonable rate. And Douglas was a reasonable man who wanted nothing but good relations with his neighbors. Elira listened to all of this. Then she said, "Mrs. Crane, I ran a general store for 7 years. I know what reasonable rates look like, and I know what a man offers when he's used something for free and doesn't want to start paying full price." Harriet's mouth tightened. "The upper pasture is 400 acres, Elira said. "We'll lease grazing rights at the county standard rate, not lower. If Mr. Crane doesn't want to pay the county standard rate, he can move his cattle off Mercer Ridge by the end of the month." "That's a significant ask," Harriet said. "It's the accurate ask," Elira said. Harriet looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman recalibrating. "My husband was under the impression that Mr. Mercer was disinclined to engage in business matters." "My husband's inclinations have changed," Elira said. "He has a family now." Harriet's eyes went to Ivy still drawing in the corner, and then back to Elira, and for just a moment, something crossed Harriet Crane's face that was not strategy, something genuine, some recognition of a woman who had found her footing and was standing on it. "I'll tell him," Harriet said. "I'd appreciate it," Elira said. When Harriet was gone, Ivy looked up from her drawing. "Who was that?" she said. "A neighbor," Elira said. "She didn't look happy." "She wasn't," Elira said, "but she'll be fine." Ivy considered. "Did you win?" Elira smiled, just slightly. "Ask me in a week." Ivy looked at her drawing. Then she said without looking up, "You're good at that." Elira looked at her. "At talking to people," Ivy said. "So they understand what you mean." "I've had practice," Elira said. "Could you teach me?" The question landed so simply and so completely that Elira had to take a moment before she answered. She looked at this child, this 7-year-old who had survived the unsurvivable, and come to a mountain, and was now sitting in a corner, asking to learn how to hold her own in the world. "Yes," she said. "I could teach you that." Ivy nodded. Returned to her drawing. Boone, who had been outside within earshot of the whole conversation, came to the doorway. He looked at Elira. She looked at him. "County standard rate," he said. "County standard rate," she confirmed. He nodded slowly. "Where'd you learn to do that?" 7 years alone," she said. "You figure out which fights to have and how to have them." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Crane's not going to like it." "Crane doesn't have to like it," she said. "He has to respect it. Those are different things." Boone was looking at her with that expression again, the unguarded one, the one he still hadn't found a box to put in. He opened his mouth and then closed it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just—" He stopped again. "Boone. I keep thinking," he said carefully, "that I should say something about what you're doing here, what you've done." He looked at his hands. "But everything I come up with sounds wrong." "Then don't say it," she said. "Elira, the wood needs splitting," she said. "Not unkindly. Go split it." He went, and she listened to the rhythm of the axe outside, steady, deliberate, the sound of a man doing the thing he knows how to do, and she thought about what Ivy had said. "You're good at talking to people, so they understand what you mean." She thought, "I am. I've always been." And there was nobody to use it on for 7 years. The letter from the county arrived on a Friday. Douglas Crane had agreed to the county standard rate. Elira read the letter twice, and then set it on the table and went to find Boone, who was in the back repairing a fence line, and she handed him the letter and watched him read it. He read it. He folded it. He handed it back. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. And then, completely unexpectedly, with no warning and no precedent in the 6 weeks she had known him, Boone Mercer laughed. Not a big laugh, not the kind that fills a room, but a real one, low and genuine, and slightly helpless, the laugh of a man who has been holding his breath for 3 years and has just for one moment forgotten to. Elira stood there and looked at him, and something happened in her chest that she had no name for and did not try to name. "Go tell Ivy," he said when the laugh had settled. "She won't know what it means." "Tell her anyway. Tell her the mountain is ours." Elira walked back to the cabin. Ivy was in the loft, and Elira climbed the ladder, and Ivy looked up from the book she was reading. She'd finished the thin one and had moved on to Longfellow, which was ambitious for 7, but she was making her own kind of sense of it, and Elira said, "The mountain is ours, all 400 acres. Ivy processed this. "Did you win?" she said. "Yes," Elira said. "We won." Ivy looked at the book. Then she looked at the yellow cloth flower on the wall. Then she looked at Elira and said in a voice that was still careful, but had something in it that had not been there before, something that was still too fragile to look at directly, but was real, was absolutely real. "Good." And from outside came the sound of the axe again splitting wood in the cold afternoon. And Elira sat on the edge of Ivy's bed, and Ivy returned to Longfellow, and the two of them sat in the quiet of the loft that smelled like cedar and wood smoke. And it was not peace yet, not exactly, but it was the shape of it, the outline that peace grows into when it is given enough time and enough choosing. That was the night everything broke open, not in the way of disaster, in the way of something that has been sealed too long finally finding a seam. It was late, and Ivy had been in the loft for 2 hours, and the cabin was quiet. Elira was reading, and Boone was at the table, with the land grant spread in front of him, tracing the boundary lines with one finger, learning the edges of what was his. And then from the loft, a sound. Not the creak of the floorboard, not the careful step on the ladder. A sound that was not any of those controlled, deliberate movements that Ivy used to navigate the world. It was crying. The real kind, the kind a child does when they think no one is listening, the kind that has been waiting behind the composure, and the deliberate voice, and the considering eyes for 6 weeks, since a train station, since a cloth bag, and a framed photograph, and a choice that a 7-year-old should never have had to make. Boone was on his feet before Elira. She touched his arm. "Wait." He looked at her. His face was doing something she had never seen it do, not the grief she'd seen, not the guilt, but something that had no distance in it at all, something completely undefended. "Let me," she said. She climbed the ladder. She went into the loft. Ivy was on the bed with her face pressed into the quilt, the blue and white one from Denver, and her whole small body was shaking with the force of the crying she'd been holding back for 6 weeks. Elira sat on the edge of the bed. She did not say anything. She put one hand on Ivy's back just lightly, and she left it there. The crying went on for a long time. When it began to slow, Ivy turned her face out of the quilt. Her eyes were swollen. She looked at Elira with the expression of someone who has been caught doing something shameful, except the shame was grief. And grief is never shameful. "I miss her," Ivy said. "I know," Elira said. "She used to—" Ivy stopped. Her breath caught. "She used to sing, at night. I could hear it through the wall." Elira kept her hand on Ivy's back. "I can't remember the song anymore," Ivy said. "I've been trying to remember it, and I can't." Her voice broke on the last word entirely, in the way of something that has been held under pressure for a very long time. "You'll remember it," Elira said. "It'll come back. That's how memory works. It comes back when you stop chasing it." Ivy looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because I've lost people too," Elira said. "And the things I thought I'd forgotten, they come back. Mostly when I'm not expecting them." Ivy was quiet. Then, "Do you miss them?" "Every day." "Does it stop?" Elira thought about the honest answer. "It changes," she said. "It doesn't stop, but it changes into something you can carry." Ivy looked at the framed photograph on the little shelf Boone had put up on the loft wall below the yellow flower specifically for it. Clara's face in the frame, dark-haired and dark-eyed and completely unknown to Elira, except through the child she had made and left behind. "She would have liked you," Ivy said. "My mother." Elira felt the words land in the center of her chest, like something she hadn't known she was waiting to hear. "I think I would have liked her too," she said. Ivy turned back into the quilt, not crying now, but settling the particular weight of a child who has put something down and is feeling the relief of the emptied arms. Elira stayed. She kept her hand on Ivy's back, and she stayed. From below, no sound, but she knew he was there. She knew he was sitting at the base of the ladder in the dark cabin, listening, unable to go up and unable to go away, and she thought, that is its own kind of staying. That is its own kind of courage. After a while, Ivy's breathing evened out and deepened. Sleep, real sleep. The first deep sleep, probably since Carson City. Elira climbed back down. Boone was exactly where she knew he would be, not at the table, not on the bench. On the floor, at the base of the ladder, his back against the wall, his knees up. He looked up at her when she came down. "She's asleep," Elira said. He didn't say anything. He looked at his hands in his lap. Then he said very quietly, "I heard her say she can't remember the song." "She will," Elira said. "Give it time." "I should know it," he said. "I should know Clara's song. I should know everything about her mother, and I know nothing. I know nothing about what her life was, what she lost, what—" His voice fractured on the last word, and he stopped. Elira sat down next to him on the floor. They sat against the wall at the base of the loft ladder in the dark cabin with the wood stove burning low, and Boone Mercer put his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. And from the loft above them came the soft, even breathing of a child who had finally put something down. "Fathers don't leave," Boone said, quoting something. His own daughter's words from a different day. "No," Elira said. "I left." "You came back." "It's not the same." "No," she agreed. "It's not. But it's what you have. And it's what she has. And you're both here now." She paused. "That's not nothing, Boone. That's everything, actually." He opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. "What do I do?" he said. For the third time she had heard him say that. But this time it was different. Not desperate, not wondering. Just a man asking a question he is ready to hear the answer to. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "when you go out to chop wood, take her with you. Don't ask. Just say, 'Come on,' and when she comes, show her how." "She's 7. "She's strong," Elira said. "Let her be." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "Elira." She looked at him. In the dim light from the wood stove, his face was open in a way she had not seen before, the scar and the jaw, and all the old damage visible, and not hidden, a man who has stopped trying to manage what he looks like. "I know I said I'd do right by you," he said. "Whatever this is, I said that the first day. I remember. I don't think—" He stopped, started again. "I don't think I knew what that meant then, what it would cost, what it—" He stopped again. His jaw worked. "What it would mean to have someone who stays in the room." Elira looked at him. "I'm staying," she said. Not an answer to a question, not a reassurance, just a fact stated plainly the way she stated facts. He looked at her, and something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not with any of the gestures of romance or declaration, just a quiet, tectonic movement, the kind that happens deep under the surface before anything above it changes. "All right," he said. They sat on the floor in the dark for a while longer, listening to the mountain outside and the sleeping child above, and neither of them said anything more, and neither of them needed to. The next morning Boone said, "Come on," and Ivy came. She didn't ask where. She didn't argue. She pulled on her coat and her wool socks and her boots, and she followed him outside into the cold pre-dawn dark, and Elira watched from the window and did not follow, because this was not hers to be part of. She heard the axe. Then she heard Boone's voice, low and instructional, too quiet to make out words. Then a longer silence, Then the axe again, but different, lighter, less certain, the sound of smaller hands on the handle. Then once a sound she had not heard from Ivy in 2 months on this mountain. A laugh. Short and surprised and real, the laugh of a child who has just done something she didn't know she could do. Elira turned away from the window and put the kettle on. When they came back inside 20 minutes later, Ivy's cheeks were red from cold, and she was holding a piece of split wood in both hands, like a trophy, and she said to no one in particular, "I did 4. "You did 4, Boone confirmed, hanging his coat. "He said I have good aim," Ivy said to Elira. "You do," Boone said. "For a beginner." Ivy set the wood down by the stove with the gravity of someone completing an official task, and then she sat at the table and picked up her book, and that was that. No ceremony, no announcement, just a 7-year-old who had split her first 4 pieces of firewood and filed it away as a fact about herself and moved on. But Elira looked at Boone, and Boone looked at Elira, and something passed between them that neither of them would have been able to articulate, but both of them understood completely. Something had shifted on the mountain, something small and structural and permanent. The weeks that followed built on that morning, the way a house builds on a foundation, incrementally, practically each piece dependent on the one before it. Ivy came with Boone every morning. She got to 6 pieces, then 8, then on a Saturday in early November, she split 12 and announced this at breakfast without looking up from her cornbread, and Boone said, "That's a full load," with the careful neutrality of a man trying not to make too much of something that means everything to him. Ivy looked up. "Is it full load for the stove?" he said. "You don't need me out there anymore." Ivy considered this. "I still want to come," she said. Boone picked up his coffee. "All right then." Elira said nothing. She ate her cornbread, and she thought, there it is. That's the thing you can't force, and can't rush, and can't build from the outside. You just have to leave room for it and wait. The 90-day visit from Aldous Fenn was scheduled for a Wednesday. Elira had been thinking about it for 2 weeks. Not with dread exactly, but with the particular alertness of a woman who knows that something is coming and intends to be ready for it. What she had not been thinking about, because she had been so focused on Fenn, was the letter that arrived 3 days before his visit. It came in the regular post addressed to Boone Mercer in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Careful, deliberate, the handwriting of someone who writes slowly to make sure each word lands right. The return address was Carson City. She left it on the table for him. He read it that evening after Ivy was in the loft. He read it once, and then he set it down, and he didn't say anything for a long time. "What is it?" Elira said. "Clara's sister," he said. "Margaret. She's coming." Elira went still. "She wants to see Ivy," he said. "She says—" He picked the letter up again. "She says she has things of Clara's that belong to Ivy, personal things. She wants to bring them herself." "When?" "End of the month." He set the letter down. "Same week as Fenn's second visit." Elira looked at the letter. Margaret. The aunt who had written to Boone 6 weeks before Ivy's arrival, who had described her niece with the accuracy of someone who had been paying very close attention. The woman who had raised the alarm that led to all of this. "Is she—" Elira chose her words carefully. "Is she coming to assess the situation, or just to bring the things—" "Both, I reckon," Boone said. "She doesn't say it, but that's what it is." He looked at his hands. "She loved Clara. Ivy lived with her for 3 years before Clara died." He paused. "She has more claim on that child than I do, in some ways." "In some ways," Elira agreed. "Not in the ways that count now." "What if she doesn't think this is enough?" he said. "What if she looks at this cabin, and this mountain, and this—" He gestured broadly, meaning all of it, meaning himself and the situation and the improvised nature of everything they had built. "What if she decides it's not right? Then she'll say so," Elira said, "and we'll listen, and we'll tell her what we know." She looked at him. "But Boone Ivy split 12 pieces of wood last Saturday and told you she still wants to come. That's not nothing. Margaret's going to see who Ivy is now. That's going to say more than anything we could. He looked at her. You're not worried. I didn't say that, she said. I said I'll handle it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you always say that. Because I always do, she said. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a movement, but it was there, and she had learned to count those small things because they were the real measure of how far he'd come. The next morning, Elira wrote Margaret a letter back. She wrote it at the store table. She had been going down to Cedar Fork twice a week to check on the building, to collect deliveries, to maintain what she'd started thinking of as her professional life, separate from but connected to the life on the mountain. The store was still hers. She hadn't sold it. She had Mrs. Aldridge managing the counter 3 days a week, which worked well enough. She wrote to Margaret plainly. She introduced herself not as Boone's wife, not as Ivy's stepmother, just as Elira, who was living on the mountain with both of them. She said Ivy was well. She said Ivy was reading Longfellow. She said Ivy could split 12 pieces of firewood and had a habit of watching birds from the loft window and drawing them in a journal Elira had given her. She said Ivy still slept with her mother's photograph on a shelf above her bed. She said, "Come, you are welcome here. Ivy needs to see you." She sent the letter, and then she sat with her ledger for a while and did not do any accounts, just sat, because there were moments when the full weight of what they were doing settled on her, and she needed to let it land before she could pick it back up. 7 years alone. Then 11 minutes in a church. Then this. She thought about what she'd been before, not unhappy, not exactly, but sealed. A woman who had made her peace with sealed because the alternative was wanting something she couldn't have. She thought about the first morning in the store after her father died, when she had opened the accounts and realized the whole weight of it was hers, now just hers, and she had sat at this same table and made herself into the kind of woman who could carry it. She had been carrying it ever since. She had gotten very good at the carrying. What she had forgotten somewhere in the 7 years was what it felt like to share the weight. She picked up her pen and went back to the accounts. Margaret arrived on a Thursday 2 days before Fen. She was not what Elira expected. She had built a picture from the letter, a practical woman, careful, devoted, and Margaret was all of those things, but she was also younger than Elira had imagined, maybe 35 with Clara's coloring, and none of Clara's softness, a woman made lean by hard years and direct by necessity. She came up the mountain road in a hired buggy with a trunk in the back, and she climbed down and looked at the cabin, and then she looked at Elira, who had come out to meet her. "You're her," Margaret said. "I'm her." Elira agreed. Margaret looked at her steadily for a moment. The same evaluating look Ivy used, and Elira understood immediately that Ivy had learned it from this woman. And then she said, "Where is she?" "Inside. She knows you're coming. She's been up since 5. Something crossed Margaret's face, not quite pain. The specific expression of someone who loves a child and has been missing her, and is about to see her and is bracing for it. Ivy came through the door before either of them moved. She stopped on the porch step. Margaret stopped on the path. They looked at each other, and then Ivy came down the step and across the path, and Margaret crouched and caught her and held on, and Ivy held back, and Elira looked at the mountain for a while and gave them time. When she looked back, Margaret was standing, and Ivy was at her side, with one hand gripping the hem of Margaret's coat, and Margaret was looking at Elira with an expression that had shifted from assessment to something more complicated. "She grew," Margaret said. "2 months is a long time at 7, Elira said. "She looks—" Margaret paused. "She looks like herself. I was afraid she wouldn't." "She's very much herself," Elira said. Ivy looked up at Margaret. "I can split firewood," she said. Margaret blinked. "You can." 12 pieces. Boone taught me." She said the name without hesitation, without the careful pause that had preceded it for the first few weeks. Just Boone. A fact. A person. Margaret looked at Elira. Elira said, "Come inside. There's coffee." The conversation that happened at the table that afternoon while Ivy was in the loft showing Margaret her bird drawings was the conversation Elira had been preparing for, without knowing she was preparing for it. Boone sat at the table, and Margaret sat across from him, and Elira sat between them, and it was not comfortable, and none of them pretended it was. Margaret said, "I need you to understand what Clara went through." Boone said, "Yes." "Not as an accusation," Margaret said. "As a fact. She raised Ivy alone. She worked 2 jobs, and she was sick for almost a year before the fever took her. And she never once—" Margaret's voice didn't break, but it came close. "She never once said a bad word to Ivy about you. She said her father was a good man who'd had hard things happen to him. That's what she told her." Boone looked at the table. "She was kinder than I deserved." "Yes," Margaret said. "She was." She paused. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse. I'm telling you because Ivy carries that story, what her mother told her. She believes her father is a good man who had hard things happen to him, and that means you have to be that. You don't get to be less than that story." "I know," Boone said. "Do you?" He looked up. "I know," he said again with the quiet certainty that Elira had come to recognize as the thing underneath all the silence, not emptiness, but bedrock. Margaret looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Elira. "And you," she said. "This was fast." "It was," Elira said. "You married a stranger to help him keep his daughter." "I married a man who told me the truth about himself," Elira said. "That's rarer than you'd think." Margaret's mouth moved, something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Clara would have liked you," she said. Elira felt it again, the same landing she'd felt when Ivy said it in the loft on the night of the crying. The same precise impact. "Ivy said the same thing," she said. Margaret looked at her carefully. She did. A few weeks ago, Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the bag she'd brought, and she put something on the table between them, a small cloth-wrapped bundle tied with string. "These are Clara's," she said. "Some letters she kept, a hair comb, a piece of her mother's wedding dress, just a square of fabric. Clara kept it all her life. Ivy should have them." "We'll give them to her together," Elira said. "You and me. She should have them from you." Margaret looked at her. "You don't want to be there." "I'll be there," Elira said. "But you should hand them to her. You're the one who kept them." Margaret picked up the bundle. She held it in her lap. Her jaw worked once. "All right," she said. The moment when they brought the bundle to Ivy was the quietest Elira had ever seen the loft. Ivy unwrapped each thing carefully, slowly, with the attention of someone who understands that what they're holding is irreplaceable. The letters, the comb, the square of white fabric. She held the fabric square for a long time. Then she pressed it against her face. No one spoke. After a while, Ivy put everything back in the cloth and tied the string and put the bundle on the shelf next to her mother's photograph below the yellow flower. "Thank you," she said to Margaret. To the shelf, really. To her mother. Margaret put her hand on Ivy's head. Just for a moment. Then she came back down the ladder, and Boone was at the bottom, and they looked at each other. This man who had abandoned Clara, and this woman who had loved Clara until the end. And Margaret said quietly and without accusation, "Don't waste it." "I won't," Boone said. She left the next morning. At the door, she said to Elira, "I'd like to write to Ivy." "Write to all of us," Elira said. "We'll write back." Margaret nodded. She climbed into the hired buggy and drove down the mountain road, and Elira and Boone and Ivy stood on the porch and watched her go. Ivy was holding the cloth bundle against her chest. She watched the buggy until it was out of sight. Then she said, "Can she come back at Christmas?" Boone looked at Elira. Elira looked at Boone. "Yes," Elira said. "We'll ask her." "We'll ask." Ivy nodded. She went inside and put the bundle back on her shelf and came back downstairs and picked up her book, and that was that. But for the rest of the day, she was different in a way that Elira couldn't name precisely, softer maybe, or more settled, as if Margaret's visit had delivered something Ivy had needed and had not known how to ask for. Fenn arrived on Saturday as scheduled. He was the same as before, gray suit, leather case, cataloging eyes. He came in and he looked around the cabin, and something in his face registered the 30 days of additional living, before his expression settled back to professional neutral. He went through his questions. He spoke to each of them. He took Ivy into the corner and spoke to her alone for 10 minutes, while Boone and Elira sat at the table and did not look at each other and did not speak. Elira could not hear what Fen was saying. She could hear Ivy's answers clear, deliberate, unhurried. She heard Ivy say, "Yes." She heard her say, "She taught me." She heard her say, "He's teaching me." She heard the word Margaret, and she heard the word Christmas. Then she heard, and she was not expecting this. It came like a door opening in a wall. She hadn't known had a door, she heard Ivy say in that clear 7-year-old voice that had no performance in it. "It feels like home." Boone's hand on the table went very still. Fen came back to the table. He sat down. He opened his notebook and he closed it again, which was not what he had done the first time, and Elira registered that. "Mr. and Mrs. Mercer," he said. They both looked at him. "I've been doing this work for 11 years, Fen said. "I've seen arrangements like this one before." He paused. "Some of them, most of them, you can see the seams. You can see where the story was put together for the visit." He looked at them steadily. "I can't see the seams here." Elira kept her face still. "Ivy is healthy," Fen said. "She is educated. She is emotionally—" He paused. "She is a child who has been through significant loss and is healing in a healthy way. That is not a given. That is the result of consistent, attentive care." He looked at Elira when he said it, then at Boone. "Both of you." Boone did not say anything. "I'm going to recommend permanent custody to the magistrate," Fen said, "with no further visits required unless a specific concern is raised." The words landed in the cabin and sat there, permanent. Elira breathed in. She breathed out. She kept her hands flat on the table. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was even. Fen stood. He shook both their hands. He said goodbye to Ivy, who was back at the table with her book, and said goodbye without looking up, and then looked up immediately after and watched him go with those dark, considering eyes. The door closed. Ivy said, "Is he done coming?" "He's done," Elira said. "Good," Ivy said. "He makes Boone nervous." Boone made a sound. Elira looked at him. He was sitting with both hands on the table, and his head bowed, and his shoulders were doing something she hadn't seen them do before, shaking just slightly, the minute tremor of a man trying to hold himself together and not entirely succeeding. "Boone," Ivy said. He lifted his head. His eyes were red. Ivy looked at him with those eyes that saw everything. Then she got up from the table and she walked to where he was sitting, and she put her small hand on his arm. Not a hug, not the gesture of a child who has fully arrived, but something deliberate, and chosen a gesture that said, "I see you. I'm still working out what to do about it. But I see you." He looked down at her hand on his arm. He put his hand over hers. Just for a moment. Then Ivy went back to the table and her book, and Boone looked at Elira, and the expression on his face was something that had no name in any language she knew. It was too large and too complicated and too real for a name. "Go chop something," she said gently. He laughed the same laugh as before, low and genuine and slightly helpless, and he got up and got his coat and went outside, and the sound of the axe started up steady and deliberate in the cold afternoon. Ivy said without looking up from her book, "He does that when he doesn't know what to feel." Elira looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I watch," Ivy said. "You said you could teach me to talk to people, but I think I'm better at watching." Elira sat down across from her. "You're not wrong," she said. Ivy looked up. "Are you going to stay?" The question was quiet and direct, and completely without preamble, which was exactly how Ivy asked every question that mattered. Elira held her eyes. "Yes. Even when you don't have to." "I don't think that's what staying means," Elira said. "Staying means you want to be where you are." Ivy processed this. Do you want to be here? Elira looked at the wood stove, at the shelf with the Longfellow and the Bible and the sewing basket, at the loft railing with Ivy's drawings pinned to it, at the window where the afternoon light was coming in cold and clear. Yes, she said. I want to be here. Ivy nodded, satisfied. She went back to her book. That night, after Ivy was asleep, Elira was banking the wood stove, and Boone came in from checking the fence line, and she handed him a cup of coffee, and he took it, and they stood together in the way they had developed in 3 months of shared evenings, not touching, not far apart, just present, just in the same space without needing to manage the fact of it. She asked me if I was staying, Elira said. What'd you say? I said yes. He looked at his cup. Did you mean it? She looked at him. I said it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the store. You're still going down twice a week. I am. You don't have to keep it, he said carefully. If the mountain is enough. You don't have to maintain both. She looked at him. Are you telling me to give up my store? No, he said immediately. No, He stopped, started again. I'm trying to say that you gave up a lot to come here. You gave up your life as it was, and I don't want you to. I don't want you to look around one day and realize you lost yourself in the giving. She looked at him for a long moment. Boone, she said. I know who I am, she said. I've known who I am for a long time. That doesn't change based on where I sleep. He looked at her. I'm keeping the store, she said. And I'm staying on this mountain. Both those things are true. They don't cancel each other. All right, he said. And you need to stop apologizing, she said. For asking me to come here, for needing what you needed. You need to stop that. He blinked. I didn't. You do it every few days, she said. You find a new way to say it, but it's always the same apology. And I need you to stop. He was very still. Because I'm not here on borrowed time, she said. I'm not here out of duty or pity or because I didn't have a better option. I'm here because I chose it. 12 times since that first morning I have chosen it again. So stop apologizing for something I keep choosing. The cabin was very quiet. Boone put his coffee cup down on the shelf. He turned to face her fully, and he looked at her. Really looked the way he had looked at her that first morning in the store, when she hadn't flinched the way that had started all of this. All right, he said. His voice was different, settled in a new place. All right, she confirmed. He picked his cup back up. He looked at the wood stove. Christmas? He said. What about it? Ivy wants Margaret to come. I know. I'll write to her this week. We should get something for Ivy, a real gift. She hasn't had... He paused. She hasn't had a Christmas with gifts, not a proper one. Clara didn't have, there wasn't much. Elira thought about this. What does she want? I don't know, he said. I've been trying to work it out. I know what she wants, Elira said. He looked at her. She wants you to carve her something, Elira said. She's seen the work you do on the fence posts. The details. She watches your hands when you work. She wants something you made. He stared at her. How do you know that? I watch, she said. Apparently it runs in the family. His face did the thing again, the unguarded, enormous, helpless tenderness that he still hadn't found a name for. What should I make? He said. A bird, Elira said. One of the ones she draws. Ask her which is her favorite, and then make it, and don't tell her you're making it. He nodded slowly. I can do that. I know you can, she said. She set her own cup down and said good night and went to the bed that was hers, now had been hers for 3 months. In the cabin that had been his for 3 years, and was theirs now in the family, that had been nobody's 3 months ago and was all of theirs now. And she lay in the dark and listened to him bank the wood stove for the night. The familiar sound of it, the sound she had learned the way you learn the sounds of a place you belong to. From the loft, the soft breathing of a child who was staying. From outside the mountain, doing what it always did. And in the center of all of it, Elira Voss, Elira Mercer, lying in the dark with her eyes open and her heart in a state she had no prior experience with. Something that was not the careful, sealed thing of 7 years alone, but its opposite, something open and a little frightening and entirely completely real. She thought, this is what I was keeping myself for. She thought I didn't know that until right now. She closed her eyes and slept, and the mountain held all of them. And it was enough, and it was more than enough. And somewhere in the deep winter dark outside, a wind came down from the upper ridge from Mercer Ridge. 400 acres of it, all of it theirs, and moved through the trees with the sound of something that had been waiting a long time to be claimed. December came in hard on Mercer Ridge. Boone felt it before anyone else did. He always felt the weather. Before it arrived, some residual sense from years of reading the mountain alone. He told Elira on a Monday that they had maybe 4 days before the first serious snow, and Elira spent those 4 days doing what she did, which was preparing. She went down to Cedar Fork twice, brought back supplies, reorganized the pantry shelf with the efficient precision of a woman who had been managing limited resources her entire adult life. She wrote to Margaret. She told her the snow was coming early this year, and that Christmas on the mountain would be cold, but there was room, and the stove ran hot, and Ivy had been asking about her every 3rd day. Margaret wrote back in 5 days, which was fast for the post. She said yes. Ivy read the letter herself. Her reading had accelerated sharply in the past 2 months, pushed by her own stubbornness and Elira's steady patience. And when she finished, she put it down on the table and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "She's really coming." "She's really coming," Elira said. Ivy picked the letter back up and read it again. Then she folded it carefully and took it upstairs to the loft, and Elira heard her moving around up there. And she knew without looking that the letter was going on the shelf. Next to the photograph. Next to the bundle. Next to the yellow flower that had started all of it. Boone had been carving for 3 weeks. He did it at night after Ivy was in the loft, sitting at the table with a small knife and a piece of cedar that he'd chosen from the woodpile with unusual care, turning it over in his hands for a long time, before he started as if the shape he wanted was already in there and he was trying to locate it before he committed. Elira had asked Ivy in the most casual way she could manage which bird she liked best. Ivy had said without hesitation, the Clark's nutcracker. The gray one with the black wings that came to the ridge in the mornings and made a sound like someone knocking on a door. Elira had told Boone. He had looked at her and nodded once and gone back to looking at his piece of cedar. What he was producing slowly over those 3 weeks was not just a bird. She could see it taking shape each night, the strong beak, the precise angle of the wings, the particular set of the body that meant this specific bird and no other. He worked slowly and with total attention, the way he did everything that mattered to him, and he kept it wrapped in a cloth when he wasn't working on it, stored in his coat pocket during the day, so Ivy wouldn't find it in the cabin. On the 14th of December, he set it on the table in front of Elira, and she looked at it for a long time. "Boone," she said. "Is it right?" he said. "The shape, is it right?" "It's perfect," she said. He looked at it. "It's not perfect." "It's right," she said. "That's better than perfect." He picked it up. He turned it in his hands. The beak was exactly right. She could see that he'd taken his time with the beak, the way it curved, the precise proportion of it. The wings were folded in the posture the bird used when it landed not in flight, but settled at rest. "She's going to know you looked at them," Elira said. "She's going to know you paid attention." He was quiet for a moment. That was the point. She looked at him. "I know." He wrapped the bird back in the cloth and put it away. Then he looked at the shelf where Elira had stacked the supplies for Christmas dried fruit, a tin of molasses, a sack of good flour she'd brought from Cedar Fork. "She's never had a proper Christmas," he said again. He said it the way he said things he hadn't finished processing, not looking for a response, just making the fact real by saying it aloud. "She's going to have one now," Elira said. He nodded. He went to the wood stove and picked up his coffee and stood there with it and said after a moment, "What about you?" She looked up from the accounts she'd been working on. What about me? Did you... He stopped. Did you have good Christmases before? She thought about it. The honest answer was complicated. She thought about her father, who had been a man of small practical gestures and very little ornamentation, and who had given her books every year because he knew she needed them, and who had died on a February morning 6 years ago and left her the store and the accounts and the silence. She thought about the Christmases after alone in the rooms above the store when she had cooked a good meal, because she believed in feeding herself well, even when there was no one to feed alongside her, and had read by the stove and told herself that alone was not the same as lonely, which was true, and also not entirely true. I had quiet ones, she said. He looked at her. That's a careful answer. Yes, she said. It is. He set his cup down. He pulled out the bench and sat across from her at the table, which was not something he did during account time. He had learned her rhythms the way she'd learned his, and account time was usually his time to be somewhere else. Elira, he said. She put down her pen. She waited. I've been trying to find the right way to say something for about 2 months, he said. And I haven't found it, so I'm going to say it wrong. She looked at him. You told me to stop apologizing, he said. And I have, but there's something on the other side of the apology that I haven't said yet. He put his hands flat on the table the way he had that first morning in the store, except this time they were not shaking. I don't know what this is, what we are. I know what we said it was going to be, a legal arrangement, practical, no promises. And I know that's not what it is anymore. And I don't know if you... He stopped. I don't know where you are with it. I don't want to assume. The cabin was very quiet. Somewhere above them the wind moved across the roof. Elira looked at this man. This enormous, careful, badly damaged, genuinely trying man who had walked into her store 4 months ago, shaking with desperation, and had been in some fundamental way the most honest person she had met in 7 years of running a business that required her to read people accurately. She said, "You built a bed in one night for a daughter you'd never met." He blinked. "You polished your boots for an 11-minute ceremony," she said. "You asked the preacher before you came to me. You moved slowly around a frightened child for 6 weeks until she was ready. You carved a bird for 3 weeks because you wanted her to know you paid attention." She held his eyes. "I've been watching you for 4 months. And what I've seen is a man who does not know how to say the right thing, but almost never does the wrong one." He was very still. "I'm not here on a contract," she said. "I haven't been for a long time." She paused. "I don't know what to call it either, but I know it's real. And I know I'm not leaving." Something happened in his face. It was not a dramatic thing. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the expression of a man who has been bracing for a long time and has just finally let himself stop. "I should have said it plainly," he said, "without all the circling." "Say it now," she said. He looked at her. "I love you," he said. "Not because you saved my daughter, not because you held this together when I couldn't. Because you're you. Because you don't flinch. Because you told me to stop apologizing and meant it." He paused. "Because you left wool socks at the bottom of the ladder and didn't say a word about it." She felt it land in the way real things land. Not with fireworks, not with the orchestrated weight of a declared moment, but with a quiet total certainty, the feeling of a thing becoming true rather than a thing being announced. "Boone," she said. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while. I was waiting for you to catch up." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something crossed his face that she had only seen a few times. The laugh low and genuine, but warmer now, easier, the laugh of a man who has learned to mean it. "Catch up," he said. "You're a slow mover," she said. "I've adjusted." He reached across the table and he put his hand over hers. The way he had put his hand over Ivy's on the day Fen came for the last time, deliberate chosen covering. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that at the table in the cabin in the December dark, and neither of them said anything more because there was nothing more that needed saying. Margaret arrived 4 days before Christmas. She came up the mountain in a hired wagon, with 2 trunks this time, and a look on her face that was different from September, less guarded, more simply glad. Ivy heard the wagon from the loft and came down the ladder so fast she nearly missed the last rung, which made Boone reach out automatically and catch her by the collar of her coat, and Ivy said, "I'm fine," without breaking stride, and went out the door and across the porch and down the steps, and Margaret was barely out of the wagon before Ivy hit her. Margaret stumbled back a step and caught her and laughed a real laugh. Unguarded, the laugh of someone who has been missing this specific small person very badly and held on. Boone stood in the doorway and watched. Elira stood beside him. She felt his shoulder against hers, and she did not move away from it. "She ran," he said. "She ran," Elira confirmed. "She hasn't run anywhere since she got here." "She's been saving it," Elira said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I didn't know she could look like that." Like what she might have asked. But she knew what he meant. She looked like a child, fully, completely, without reservation. A child being held by someone she loved, laughing in the cold. "She's getting there," Elira said. "Yeah," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "She is." The 4 days before Christmas were the fullest the cabin had ever been, and Elira watched the fullness of it with the specific attention of a woman who knows that some periods of life are worth memorizing in their particulars. Margaret took over the corner of the table with her knitting. Ivy followed her around the cabin asking questions in that relentless, clear voice, until Margaret said, "Ivy, sit down and let me think." And Ivy sat down with great dignity and immediately started asking questions again at a slightly lower volume. Boone cooked. This was new, not the salt pork and cornbread of the early months, but actual cooking, deliberate, and considered as if the arrival of guests had given him permission to do something he'd been wanting to do. He made a venison stew that was better than anything Elira could have produced, which she told him, and he said, "You know how to do everything else." Without looking up from the pot, which was so close to a compliment, she decided to count it as one. Margaret watched him from her corner of the table one evening when Ivy was in the loft, and Elira was mending by the stove, and she said quietly enough that only Elira could hear, "He's different from what I expected." "What did you expect?" Elira said. "The letters, the reports, a man who'd shut himself away." She paused. "I expected damage." "The damage is there," Elira said. "It doesn't go away. But damage isn't the whole of a person." Margaret looked at her. "No," she said. "It isn't." On Christmas Eve, Elira made a cake, a real one, with the good flour, and the molasses and dried fruit from Cedar Fork. Ivy stood on a stool beside her and stirred when Elira told her to stir, and asked 7 questions about why each ingredient did what it did, which Elira answered seriously, because Ivy's questions always deserved serious answers. Boone sat at the table and whittled. Not the bird that was done and wrapped and hidden. Something else, just to keep his hands busy. He was watching Ivy without appearing to watch her, that particular quality of attention he'd developed over 4 months of learning his daughter. Margaret was writing letters at the other end of the table. At some point, she looked up and took in the whole cabin, the stove, the cake, Ivy on her stool, Boone and his whittling Elira, with flour on her sleeve, and she looked back down at her letter and did not say anything. But Elira saw her face in that moment, and what was on it was unmistakable. A woman who had spent 6 years watching her sister build something alone, and who was now looking at what that daughter had been given, and the complicated, painful, grateful thing that recognition was. Christmas morning. Ivy came down the ladder at 5 in the morning, which was earlier than usual, and stood in the middle of the cabin in her nightgown and wool socks, and looked at the small arrangement of things Elira had put by the wood stove the night before the cake wrapped. Margaret's packages, 3 of them in brown paper, and the cloth-wrapped thing that was Boone's. She stood and looked at it all for a long moment. Then she looked at Elira's bed, where Elira was watching her from under the quilt. "Is it time?" Ivy said. "Go wake Margaret," Elira said. "She'll want to be here." Ivy went to the corner where Margaret had been sleeping on the spare pallet and she shook her shoulder with the directness of a child who has decided that the social niceties of waking a sleeping adult do not apply on Christmas morning. Margaret surfaced with the immediate alertness of someone accustomed to being needed fast and said, I'm up, and sat. Boone was already awake. He was always awake before dawn. He came in from outside. He'd been checking the horses. He always checked them first thing, and he looked at the scene in the cabin. All of them gathered around the wood stove in the early dark, and he stopped in the doorway. Ivy looked at him. Come in, she said. You're letting the cold in. He came in. He closed the door. He sat on the bench. They opened Margaret's gifts, first a pair of warm gloves for Ivy, a book Elira hadn't read, a jar of preserves she'd put up herself, dark cherry. For Boone a compass, the good kind, brass and accurate, which he turned in his hands and looked at Margaret and said, Thank you. In the voice he used when thank you was the whole of what he had, and he meant it to be enough. Then the cloth-wrapped thing. Elira handed it to Ivy. That one's from your father, she said. Ivy looked at the cloth. She unwrapped it slowly, the way she unwrapped everything that mattered. The cloth fell away, and she held the bird in both hands and looked at it. She didn't speak. Boone watched her. His jaw was set, and his eyes were careful, and he was doing the thing he'd learned to do, staying in the room, staying present, not filling the silence with anything. Ivy turned the bird over. She looked at the wings, the beak, the set of the body. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Boone. It's the Nutcracker, she said. Yes, he said. The one that comes in the mornings. Yes. You watched them, she said. I did. Her face did something he had not seen it do before. Not the careful composure, not the considering look, not the grief wearing itself out. Something entirely undefended, the face of a child receiving a thing she didn't know how to hold because it was too precisely right. Papa, she said. The word landed in the cabin like something that had been falling from a very long way up and had finally reached the ground. Boone's face broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just broke the way things break when they have been held under pressure for long enough and the thing holding them finally releases. He reached out and Ivy stepped forward and he put his arms around her. This enormous man and this small girl, and Ivy pressed her face into his shoulder and held the carved Nutcracker against his back with both hands. Nobody said anything. Margaret looked at the wall. Elira looked at the wood stove. They gave him the time. They gave them both the time as long as it needed to be. When Ivy pulled back, she looked at the bird again. Then she looked up at Boone. I'm going to put it next to Mama's picture, she said. Is that okay? That's exactly right, Boone said. His voice was wrecked, and he didn't care. Ivy climbed the ladder with the bird held in both hands, careful and deliberate, and they heard her moving around in the loft, the small sounds of a child placing something exactly where she wants it. Then she climbed back down. Okay, she said. Can we have the cake now? Margaret made a sound that was almost certainly a laugh converted at the last second into a cough. Elira got up and started cutting the cake. Boone sat on the bench with his elbows on his knees and his head down for another moment, and then he straightened, and he was himself again, or not himself, as he had been, but himself as he was becoming, which was different and better and still in progress. They ate cake for breakfast on Christmas morning, all four of them at the table. Margaret with her tea and Ivy with her cake, and the particular pleased gravity of a child who has gotten exactly what she wanted and knows it, and Boone sitting across from Elira, and Elira looking at him and him looking at her. Later that afternoon, when Margaret and Ivy were in the loft, going through the second trunk, which turned out to contain more of Clara's things, more carefully preserved pieces of a life that deserved to be kept, Boone came to stand beside Elira at the wood stove. She was making coffee. He stood close the way he stood now, the way that had become natural over 4 months of proximity and choice. She called me Papa, he said. I heard, Elira said. I wasn't. He stopped. I wasn't prepared for that. Nobody ever is, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You didn't tell her to. No, She just decided. She's been deciding for a while, Elira said. You just got to watch the moment it finished. He looked at the ceiling at the loft at the sound of Ivy's voice above them, explaining something to Margaret with the detail and precision of a child sharing a thing she loves. He looked at that sound with his whole face open. Then he looked at Elira. You didn't just save my daughter, he said. She looked at him. I know I said I'd do right by you, he said. That first morning, on the porch. I said that like it was a promise I was making to you. He held her eyes. But you're the one who did right. By her. By me. By all of it. His voice was steady now, not wrecked, just clear. You walked into a stranger's cabin, and you made a flower out of buttons for a child you'd never met. You faced down Harriet Crane and Aldous Fenn, and you wrote to Margaret, and you taught Ivy to add, and you... He stopped. You made this a home. I was just living in a cabin. You made it a home. Elira looked at him. She thought about what to say. She thought about the 7 years before this, and the 11 minutes in the church, and the 40 minutes on horseback up a mountain road, and the flower that had started as a practical decision and become something she would not take back for anything in the world. You let me, she said. That's the part people don't say. You opened the door, and you let me in, and you didn't make me prove I was worth keeping. That's not nothing, Boone. That's everything. He looked at her. I'm staying, she said. Not because I said I would, because I want to. Every morning I wake up on this mountain, and I choose it again. That's not obligation, that's home. He reached out, and he put his hand against the side of her face. Careful and deliberate, the same care he brought to the carved bird and the fence line, and everything he did that mattered. She put her hand over his. Merry Christmas, she said. Merry Christmas, he said. From the loft, Ivy's voice. Elira, come look at this. Elira stepped back. She called up, coming. She went to the ladder. She paused with her hand on the rung, and she looked at Boone still standing by the wood stove with his coffee and his open face, and his whole recovered life arranged around him in this cabin on this mountain. Your daughter is calling, she said. He smiled. The real kind. The kind he'd had in him all along, just waiting for somewhere safe enough to live. Go on then, he said. She climbed the ladder. Ivy was sitting on the bed with Margaret beside her, and spread across the quilt between them were photographs and letters and small pieces of cloth, and one pressed flower brown with age that had been tucked inside an envelope and survived however many years by some minor miracle of careful keeping. Ivy held up the pressed flower. Mama kept this, she said, from her wedding. Margaret says it was a wildflower from the meadow near where she grew up. Elira sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at the flower. She looked at the shelf above the bed, the photograph of Clara. The bundle, the carved bird with its folded wings and its precisely right beak. The yellow cloth flower with 4 wooden buttons. She kept things that mattered, Elira said. She kept everything, Ivy said. She set the flower down carefully. She looked at the shelf. She looked at the carved bird. Then she looked at Elira with those dark, clear, considering eyes. The eyes that saw everything. The eyes that had been working out whether any of this was worth the trouble since the moment she stepped off the train in September. I'm glad you said yes, Ivy said. Elira went very still. When he asked you, Ivy said. I'm glad you said yes. Margaret was looking at the quilt. Elira looked at Ivy. At this child who had split 12 pieces of firewood and read Longfellow and drawn birds from the window and walked into a store in Carson City one morning with her mother's photograph and a cloth bag and her whole extraordinary battered resilient self. So am I, Elira said. Ivy nodded, satisfied, settled. She picked up one of the letters and handed it to Margaret and said, Read me this one. And that was that the moment closed, the way Ivy's moments always closed cleanly, without ceremony, filed away in the place where she kept the things that mattered. That night, after Margaret was asleep in her corner, and Ivy was in the loft with the carved bird on the shelf, and the photograph, and the pressed flower, and all the pieces of her mother that had found their way to a mountain in the middle of winter. Boone and Elira sat at the table in the last of the firelight. Not talking, not needing to. Just two people in the same space, which was everything. After a while, Boone reached into his coat pocket and he set something on the table between them. A small thing. A ring not bought, not jeweler's work. Made. Cedar and copper wire wound together in a simple band, the kind of thing a man makes when he wants to give something and has only his hands to work with. Elira looked at it. "It's not much," he said. "It's right," she said. "That's better than much." She picked it up and she put it on, and she held her hand out and looked at it on her finger, the cedar warm and the copper catching the light. And then she looked at him. "You made this," she said. "After the bird," he said. "While you were doing the accounts." She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him. This man, this mountain, this impossible chosen real life. "Boone Mercer," she said. "Elira Mercer," he said back. Just her name. His name. Both of them together, which was what they were. She reached across the table and took his hand and held it, and the fire burned low, and outside the mountain held its long winter quiet, and inside the cabin everything that had been broken had not disappeared, but had been built into something stronger than what it replaced: a family. Made not from obligation or accident or blood, but from the radical, daily, irreversible act of choosing each other. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was more than enough. And on Mercer Ridge, in the deep of a mountain winter, with a child sleeping above them, and 400 acres of belonging stretching out in every direction, Elira Voss had finally, completely, and without reservation, come home.